Welcome to this lecture in the series of perspectives for a European security strategy towards Asia. You know that this lecture series is organized jointly by the European Institute of the Institute of European Studies and the Brussels Institute of Contemporary China Studies, of which I am the director. The aim of the series is to discuss the relationship between the EU and Asia as far as EU security is concerned. And yeah, that's of course quite obvious why this is an important topic, because as we all can witness day by day, Asia is becoming more and more the geopolitical point of gravity in world politics, and whether she likes it or not, the Union has to come to grips with that evolution. And of course, an important question in this area is how Europe should cope with other stakeholders in Asia. And therewith we come to the topic of today. Today we will discuss the Asian dimension of a European strategy towards Russia. And we have been able to see that Moscow has repeatedly shown its willingness to position itself as a geo-economic center between Asia and Western Europe. And it tries to get more leverage and get more value out of its natural resources. And the panelists of today will try to give an answer to the question how Russia is determined to expanding its relations in the East and how this will affect the European Union's interests. And I'm very delighted to present the speakers of today. We have really two prominent experts. Let me first introduce to you, on my extreme right, Professor Robert Ross. He is a professor of political science at Boston College. He is an associate of the John King Fairbank Center of East Asia Research at Harvard University. He is also a senior advisor of the Security Studies program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And last but not least, he is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Needless to say that he is one of the foremost American specialists on Chinese foreign and defense policy and US-China relations. As a second speaker today, we have Dr. Fraser Cameron, who is the director of the EU-Russia Center. He is a former academic and diplomat. Dr. Cameron was an advisor in the European Commission for more than 10 years and served at the EU's delegation in Washington, D.C. He is a visiting professor at several European universities in Asia and the United States, and the author of several books on and articles on European and international affairs. Robert Ross will more give an American perspective, and then Dr. Fraser Cameron will more present the European view. Robert, you have the floor.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Gustav. This is my first visit to Belgium, my first visit to the Institute, and only recently have I begun to explore the issue of EU-China relations, so this has been an excellent opportunity to do this. So thank you to Gustav and thank you to Dr. Gross for arranging all of my work here. It's really a pleasure to be here. What I want to talk about today is Russia's reemergence as a great power and its implications for Sino-Russian relations, and by extension for Sino-American relations and U.S. security. First, I believe that Russia will reemerge. I think this is simply a given. Right now, of course, Russia, like many countries, is suffering from this global recession. But on the other hand, I think Russia will emerge in a matter of time, and it will emerge as a European power. And this is not difficult to do. I like to think about Europe as a low-tech theater. It doesn't require much high technology, airplanes, missiles, to be a great power in Europe. It requires simply a large ground force, boots on the ground, the ability to put forces on other countries' borders and to threaten. And Russia, of course, has the ability to do this. Indeed, our recent developments in Georgia, simply the first step in Russia re-exerting its ground force capability. Now, of course, the Russian experience in Georgia was not good. The airlift capability was very poor, the forces did not perform well, but the point was that it didn't take much to do a lot. And this is simply the first step. It's not hard to do because it requires money, discipline, and low-tech weaponry, tanks, artillery, personnel vehicles. And of course, since 1815, the Russians have always come back. They came back after the Napoleonic Wars, they came back after the Crimean Wars, the Russians came back after 1878, the War of the Ottoman Empire, they came back after World War I, the Russian Revolution, and they came back after World War II, so forth. It's a matter of time. They have the education, they have the population, they have the resources, and of course they have the proximity to the front to make them a recurring great power. So I think this is a given. It's just a question of time. The question is, what happens elsewhere? And what are the implications of the rise of Russia in Europe for other regions? Now, I think it's important that we understand that Russia has three strategic theaters. This is Europe, this is Central Asia, and this is the Russian Far East. And it's important to understand that Russia has to prioritize. It can't re-emerge simultaneously in these three regions simultaneously, and it has to select where it's going to put its forces first. And I would argue that the number one concern for the Russians is Europe. And as Russia re-emerges, its primary focus is going to be on the European theater. Now, why is this? Well, the first thing is because of, simply put, NATO expansion. Of course, we all remember the Clinton administration when we began NATO expansion, how this was expanding democracy. Nonsense. This was expanding American military power right up to Russian borders. This is what we call NATO, a military alliance. The expansion of the military alliance to Russian borders is an extension of American power. So a primary Russian objective is to roll back NATO expansion, to get American power off of its borders. And of course, American power, NATO expansion, is in the most strategically sensitive part of Russia. Russia has its population centers, Russia has its industrial centers, and of course the part of Russia from which invasion has always come, from Eastern Europe, from Europe into Russia. So I would argue that as we see the rise of Russia, the number one priority will be Europe. Well, then I would suggest the number two priority is going to be Central Asia. Now, in Central Asia, of course, the challenge, the rollback, is not going to be the United States. The United States is not a Central Asian power. We are a third-ranked, fourth-ranked, fifth-ranked power in Central Asia. The only two powers that matter in Central Asia are China and Russia. So to the extent that Russia re-emerges in Central Asia, the challenge will be China. But this will be the second priority for Russia. It's important. It's the soft underbelly. Many Russian minorities coexist on both sides of the border between Russia and Central Asia. Resources exist in Central Asia, oil in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And of course, it's in Central Asia where it will be relatively easier for Russia to project power because it's closer to its population centers and its infrastructure. Finally, the third priority, the last priority, is going to be the extension of Russian military influence and Russian power in the Russian Far East, Korean Peninsula, and the North Pacific, the areas that border China and border Japan, China, United States, and the Western Pacific. This is the lowest priority. It'll be a long time coming. And indeed, we may not see the re-emergence of Russia as a Northeast Asian power for many, many decades. Now, why is that? Why is the Russian Far East the weakest area? And this, of course, has implications for Sino-Russian relations. Well, it's important to remember that for all of our understanding of Russia as an Asian power, Russia has rarely been a great power in Asia. If you begin after the Crimean War in 1855, you have approximately 160 years of time. The amount of time that Russia has been a great power in the Far East is maybe 30 years, and that's all. The rest of the time, Russia has been a second or third-rank power. So we have the period from Russian expansion, migration, and political control beginning in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. And they were quite successful in the 1880s and 1890s as their power followed the migration. But why was this? This was primarily because there was a power vacuum in Northeast Asia. The Chinese, of course, were on their back with a weak government, with occupation by foreigners, the Civil War. The Japanese had yet to develop their own power. The Americans were not yet interested in developing a large navy for East Asia. So the Russians were quite successful in moving in. But then what happened, as soon as the Japanese had any kind of capability whatsoever, they rapidly defeated the Russians decisively and quickly in the Russo-Japanese War. Both in land and in sea, the Russians were devastated and destroyed. As soon as a real Asian power developed, the Russians could no longer compete. Well, what happened after the Russo-Japanese War? Well, then we had the Russian Revolution and World War I, where we had Russian preoccupation primarily with Europe and domestic affairs. And then what happened? Well, then we had World War II in Germany. And we had, again, Russian ignoring, for the most part, the Russian Far East, focusing on the rise of Germany, and then focusing on World War II. Well, what happened after World War II? There was, of course, the Sino-Soviet relationship, the Sino-Soviet alliance in the Russian Far East. But what was this alliance predicated upon? It was predicated upon Russian weakness. There were no Russian troops in the Russian Far East in the 1950s and most of the 1960s. There were no Russian aircraft in the Russian Far East. There was nothing there. And so one reason the Russians and the Chinese had that strong relationship is because the Russians didn't threaten the Chinese. This was an easy area to cooperate because the Chinese looked north, there was no Russian threat. The Russians looked at China and said, we can cooperate. Now, of course, this all began to change in the late 60s and early 70s and 80s as we began to see a Russian buildup in the Russian Far East. This was taking place in two areas. One was on the border with China, where eventually we saw 44, 45 Soviet divisions deployed along the Chinese border, and we saw the buildup of the Russian Pacific Fleet. Both efforts failed. They failed in any effort to develop the Pacific Fleet as the Reagan administration launched an arms race, a naval arms race against the Russians, and Secretary of the Navy Lehman wanted a 600-ship Navy. And of course it failed against China, as ultimately the Chinese were able to defeat the Russians in the Sino-Soviet Cold War. Soviets attempted to launch a fleet, but that first aircraft carrier was launched only in 1991, just as the Soviet Union collapsed. So, there are two major experiences in Russian history as it being a great power. The first was in the 1880s and 90s, and of course when they failed in that, in the Russo-Japanese War. And the second was in the 1970s and 80s, and they failed with that with two Cold Wars, one with the United States and one with China. The Russian experience is short, and it's been unsuccessful. Why is this? Well, primarily this is simply because of an old-fashioned understanding of geography. The Russian Far East has a number of geographic impediments to Russia being a great power. One is simply distance. It is a very long way from the Russian Far East in the North Pacific to the heartland west of the Urals. And that distance has always been a problem. But that distance has been compounded by weather. It is very, very cold throughout the entire Russian Far East. Permafrost exists out there. So this has two implications. One is for infrastructure. There is still no infrastructure in the Russian Far East. The Russians have been trying for decades and decades to have a second railway. Still not very successful. Still no roads. Why has there been no energy development in the Russian Far East? Because its infrastructure is so poor. Very difficult to build roads and railways and airports, energy plants, so on and so forth. The second impact of weather is demography. The United States began going west to California the very same time the Russians began going east. Both of our countries had a great migration. Well, when Americans went west, we found many things. We found wine in the Napa Valley. We found gold in California. And we found the Pacific Ocean, beautiful beaches. And so the American people just kept going west because they wanted to. When the Russian people went east, they decided they didn't want to go. It was cold, it was inhospitable, and the only way the Russians were truly able to populate the Russian Far East over time was, of course, the Gulag. They had to make people go. So the problem is there's still no one in the Russian Far East. And the third problem, of course, is a warm water port. The Russians have always been looking for a warm water port in the northern Pacific, and they never got one. Why were they expanding into Manchuria, into Lushan and Port Arthur? Because they wanted a port. Into Korea, they wanted a port. Well, they failed in the Russo-Japanese War, so all they had was Vladivostok. The problem with Vladivostok is two things. By the 1880s, 1890s, 90% of the population of Vladivostok was not Russian. People were going into Vladivostok from China, from Korea, but not from Russia. Second of all, it was a closed port, and so the Russians actually took their great power navy and put it in Japan during the winter. Not a great power here. And third, the resources for the Russian fleet were all imported. It was easier to get them from Japan, get them from China, and to get them from west of the Urals. So for all these geographic reasons, in a three-front situation of Europe, Central Asia, and the Far East has always been last as a priority for the Russians. Now, is there Sino-Soviet competition in Central Asia, and could this have implications for this entire story of the Russian Far East and for great power relations? Well, the Chinese are penetrating Central Asia, and the Russians are very passive, has to be said. First, there is investment going into Central Asia from Chinese private citizens. There are no Russian private citizens who can invest even in Russia, nonetheless, in the Central Far East, in Central Asia. Second, there is Chinese aid, infrastructure projects going everywhere. The Russians are going begging for aid for their own infrastructure projects. There's Chinese investment in oil, building pipelines, not just in Kazakhstan, but in Uzbekistan and in Tajikistan. Well, when the Russians want to build pipelines, say in the Far East to China or Japan, they have to ask other countries for the money. They don't have their own money. So here is the Chinese penetrating in Central Asia, challenging Russia's presence with an economic capability. Second, there's a military capability. In some parts of Central Asia, the Russians border. But they don't have any common border with Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. There is a common border with Russia and China for Kazakhstan. But the Chinese army is far more capable, far better disciplined, far better equipped, far better paid than the Russian army. So in both strategic trends and in economic trends, this is a region that is quickly becoming more Chinese than Russian. It is not an accident that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization instead of the Russian Cooperation Organization. This is Chinese leadership because trends are moving in the Chinese direction. And the Russians, of course, are not happy. They are trying to compete in Kazakhstan, trying to influence Kazakhstan's pricing of oil, trying to object to pipelines going from Central Asia to China, but they have been unsuccessful. Trying to compete with China, but they have no capital to build roads, capital to build pipelines. So the question is, as we're seeing China penetrate into Central Asia, as we're seeing China challenge Russia in a Russian sphere of influence, is this likely to elicit greater Sino-Russian competition? Now I would suggest the answer to that is no. And the reason is very simple. If Russia fails to cooperate with China in Central Asia, China can challenge Russia in the Far East. That is to say, the Chinese hold the Russian Far East hostage to cooperative Russian behavior in Central Asia. The only reason why this Russian Far East is still Russian is because the Chinese cooperate. If China wanted to, the Russian Far East would be Chinese. The Chinese cooperate with the Russians in border control. They don't have to. The Chinese are far more capable of controlling that border than the Russians. If they stop cooperating, there'd be a lot more Chinese. Chinese want to take some land with their military. There's nothing the Russians can do. If the Russians want to keep the Russian Far East Russian, they have to have good relations with China. So how do we see this? Do we see Sino-Russian competition? Do we see this happening? And I would say, no, we don't. We see both Russia and China doing everything possible to maintain cooperation. In part, this reflects Russian weakness. Look at Russian weakness in the Russian Far East. At the end of the Cold War, there were 14 million people there. Now some estimates are down to 7 or 8. The population is declining faster in the Russian Far East than elsewhere in Russia. And who is leaving the Russian Far East? The best educated and the younger population. So that as you go forward, the people who are left in the Russian Far East aren't having any children. So the population will decline even faster in the future. Meanwhile, migration continues to increase. By some estimates, there are hundreds of thousands of migration every year into the Russian Far East. Over 90% of these migrants are Chinese. Now, what is the Mongolians' greatest fear? The Mongolians' greatest fear is the Chinese will move into Mongolia and marry their women, and there won't be any Mongolians left. That's not paranoid. That's a real problem. On a larger scale, over a longer time frame, that is the challenge of the Russian Far East. The population is declining, whereas migrants are increasing. They are farming, they are investing, they are building homes. The long-term implication for the Russian Far East being Russian is not good. And of course, the infrastructure remains very poor, as we discussed before. There's only one railway line, the roads are very few and limited, electricity is limited. And finally, the Russian military in the Far East is almost non-existent. The Russians finally put their first submarine back to sea from the North Pacific earlier, late last year. China's aircraft, buying Russian aircraft. They're buying aircraft from Russia that the Russian military can't buy. So here the Chinese have air superiority in the Russian Far East with Russian equipment. To the extent that the Russians have aircraft in the Russian Far East, their pilots train 45 hours in 1 year. The Chinese are much better trained pilots. So what do we see? We see the Russians vulnerable in the Russian Far East, weak economically, weak militarily. And what is right across from the border? A vibrant, dynamic China. 150 million people live in the provinces just south of the border. With economic growth rates until, well, even recently, still growing in that part of China, 4, 5, 6, 7% a year. Infrastructure, electricity, education, well-trained army. That's the difference. That part of Russia has no people. That part of China has lots of people. In some respects, the Sino-Russian border in the Russian Far East is no different than the U.S.-Canadian border. And that's how we have to think about it. The U.S.-Canadian border is dominated by the United States, with 300 million people to 30 million Canadians. The Russian Far East is dominated by 150 million Chinese in that particular region, with 7 million Russians. So once again, the Russian Far East is Russian because of Chinese cooperation. So the Russians have to do all they can to maintain cooperation with China. Now recently, if we look at Putin and the rise of Russia, Putin has become proactive, belligerent, contentious, arguing none of that with China. Putin is not a nationalist leader striking out everywhere. He's a good tactician, a good strategist who knows what he wants to do. So here he is arguing with the United States, arguing with Georgia, giving problems to the Ukraine, and there are no problems in the Russian Far East. There are no Sino-Russian problems. They don't exist. He's picking his battles, because the last thing he needs is a battle with China. So most recently, we had the issue of Kyrgyzstan asking the American outpost, I will not call this a base because this is not a base, this is a small airfield with storage facilities, to leave Kyrgyzstan. This was directed against the United States, not against China. This is a flexing of Russian muscles directed against Europe and NATO, not against China. Sino-Russian summits continue, trade continues, even arms sales. That's slowed down in recent years. But this is not because of hostility. This is because of a rising China needs Russian weapons less. And they may pick up again as if China built an aircraft carrier and needs Su-33s to put on the aircraft carrier. But we shouldn't interpret the decline of arms sales as a conflict, but simply a trend as the importance of Russian weaponry decreases. Interesting. When the Russians invaded Georgia, what was the Chinese response? Very, very careful. They didn't want to pick a fight with the United States, but they were clearly sympathetic for two reasons. One, because the Russians, they enjoy seeing the Russians fight back against American hegemony. And two, over the longer run, Russian challenges to NATO are beneficial to China. That common concern for American power. So we don't see the emergence of Russian conflict with the United States matched by Russian conflict with China. I would suggest what we're seeing is a repeat of the 1950s in great power politics, global politics. Americans are waiting for a new superpower to balance American unipolarity. Will America have a peer competitor to create a global balance, create a balance of power in the world? This is the wrong question. Great power conflict, balance of power, they are never global. They are always regional. So for example, 19th century, Europe, Great Britain was a superpower. The only superpower. But the great power conflict wasn't in East Asia, it wasn't in the Caribbean, it was in Europe. And the war was fought over Europe, not the global balance. Today, there's only one superpower. But to the extent there is great power conflict and balancing, it will take place in regions. Well, how will this happen? Well, after World War II, the United States was the world's only superpower. But no one spoke of post-World War II American unipolarity. No one spoke of post-World War II American global hegemony. Why? Because the United States was fighting two great powers, competing with two great powers simultaneously, but in two different regions. We were competing with the Russians and their ground forces in Europe, and we were competing with the Chinese in Asia, in Korea, in Vietnam, in Taiwan. And America's burden, the challenge for the United States, was that it had to contend with two great powers in different regions simultaneously, and that created the global balance of power. I would suggest that we're going to see that reemerge. We're going to see Russia become a great power in Europe once again. And when it does, it's going to say, Lithuania, member of NATO? No. Poland? Cooperating strategically with the United States? No. Romania? No. This is our sphere of influence. And it's not hard to put pressure on these states because ground forces can do it. And so once again, we're going to see a Russian ground force presence challenging stability and the balance of power in Europe, while the United States simultaneously deals with the rise of China in Asia. And to the extent that Europe cannot contend by itself with the rise of Russia, the United States will have to do it again. But this time it will be more difficult for the United States, because last time we were dealing with Russia, ground force capability, but a very weak China, led by Chairman Mao, who, in retrospect, looks very good for the United States. Right? He may have been revolutionary, he may have been ideological, but half his soldiers carried wooden guns. This China is a challenge. This is a rising power. And this time, when we have Russia in Europe, we'll have a rising power in China growing at 8-10% a year, and will pose a far greater challenge to the United States and Asia. And the combination will be a far more difficult challenge for the United States in 10 years than it faced in Europe in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. You did it again.
I promised I would be provocative. So I guess that.
So, Karen, you have the floor.
How did we get with 12.9? Okay, well thanks very much, Gustav. Thank you to Eva for the invitation. It's certainly not my first time in Belgium or even at this institute, but it's a pleasure to be here and talk a little bit about the subject that interests me greatly, and that is the future direction of Russian policy and the implications for EU, with a special reference to how Russia behaves in Central Asia and the Far East. This is the areas I'm going to talk about. I would largely agree with much of what Robert said, but I would think right at the beginning the area I disagree most is his assumption about the inevitable rise of Russian power. I would dispute that. I don't think Russia has got the resources actually to do that. We'll come to that a little bit later. This is really my summary of what's happening just now. I think we all are in danger of underestimating the gravity of the financial and economic crisis and its implications for international relations. I think nobody can really predict what these implications will be, but I think it's a fair guess that they are going to have enormous consequences for the future of international relations. I think the United States will remain what Madeleine Albright called the indispensable nation for the foreseeable future, but American power is on the decline. You just look at the amazing figures which Obama spelled out yesterday in his speech to Congress about the size of the debt, both national and private, facing America, and the implications of this are absolutely astonishing. And Europe, of course, has got its own problems, particularly at the moment, how to preserve the single market. I would say that's arguably the biggest problem facing the EU at the present time. And of course, getting the Lisbon Treaty. Now, I agree Russia is back on the world stage, but only in one area, as an energy superpower. And the domestic problems, which you touched upon, Robert, I think are far wider than just the areas that you mentioned here. Now, both Europe and Russia are certainly paying more attention to both Asia and the Central Asia, but there's different driving forces at work here. Russia is essentially seeking anti-US, anti-Western allies, if you like, and the EU is belatedly seeking new energy sources, new markets, and support for the multilateral system. Now, what are currently Russian priorities and interests? Well, inevitably, in the kind of political system we have, it's maintaining the present political leadership. That's priority number one. I would caution anyone to read too much into alleged splits between Putin and Medvedev. Medvedev owes everything to Putin. Putin can get rid of him tomorrow like that. So the idea that Medvedev can take any real independent decision for the foreseeable future is, I'm afraid, just not true. They know that they're in severe crisis now. The language of ministers, including Putin and Medvedev, in the last few weeks has changed dramatically. 6 months ago, there was still the typical arrogance you got more from Putin than Medvedev. We are back, we are the superpower. This has changed. If you look at all the statistics in terms of capital flight, the crash of the stock market, the lack of domestic investment, record unemployment, Russia faces huge domestic problems just now. Huge domestic problems. So surviving the current crisis is going to be incredibly difficult for them. Putin has failed. Putin was an incredibly lucky guy. Anybody can be a good prime minister or president if you come in and oil price goes up to $140 a barrel for a lot of your time in office. It's pretty easy. Pretty easy to be popular if you control the media as well. He failed to diversify the economy, which was allegedly his number one priority, and now they're paying the price for this. Now, they definitely want recognition as a great power. They want influence over their neighbours, and they're prepared to use energy as really the only weapon they have. The ground forces is not a serious issue, and we can discuss this later, Robert, but I honestly think, the idea that we're going to have Russian troops trying to squeeze Lithuania or Poland out of NATO is simply not going to happen. Now, the new doctrine enunciated last summer is quite interesting. It's the only problem was the timing, because it was actually published about 3 weeks before the Georgia crisis, when under the new doctrine they committed themselves to working through the UN, to peaceful solutions of conflicts, multilateral approach, etc. But at the same time, if you look at some of the messages in that doctrine, there was also the recognition that they would have to deal with the major powers. The US, China, were up there in an individual category. And then it's interesting to see how they categorize the powers. Even within the European Union, there was different categories of relationships with Germany, France, Italy up there on their own in a category above the UK and other countries, for example. Then, in that doctrine, they recognized that they would have to do more in Central Asia and develop a partnership with China. But surprisingly enough, Japan and India were hardly mentioned in there. Now, what are the EU priorities just now? Well, I think everybody would agree that these are the top priorities just now. This is what everyone is talking about. If you look at the more on the foreign policy side, I would say restoring ties with the US is certainly what everybody wants to be the #1 issue. I rather think it's going to be more difficult than some people would suggest. But a good indication of where any organization has its priorities is where you spend your money. And the EU spends most of its budget in its immediate neighborhood. Most of the money goes to the Western Balkans, goes to the new neighborhood policy, and Middle East, North Africa. That's where most of the EU money is going, and that's where the priorities are. Now, we call China, India, and Japan our strategic partners, but that begs the question, what is a strategic partner? And I think it's something we can discuss later. And at the bottom of the list is Central Asia. Now, Central Asia, we often make the mistake of thinking that this is a bloc. It's not. They are 5 proud, independent states. They don't actually often talk to each other. They have quite different interests, quite different resources, a lot of problems between them here. But, of course, they as a bloc are not a unitary actor. Russia, China, and the US are. And that makes a difference when you actually look at how states play the game in Central Asia. But what is prevalent in Central Asia and in Russia, to some extent in China, is a continuation of the idea of the zero-sum game. You can win a country or lose a country. To some extent, you still get that in the US. You have this ridiculous debate, who lost China? Who lost Russia? As if it was an American's gift to lose, a country like Russia or China. It's ridiculous. But, this mentality still colors perceptions in Moscow and in Central Asia here. Now, Robert's right, the EU is not viewed as a major player. We're very late into the game here. And it is telling, I think, that it is called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization here. But you should underestimate the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which Russia is trying to build up now. Particularly just in the last year or so, they've been making moves in the defense field for a joint air defense, for training, and establishing a rapid reaction force similar to what NATO has been trying to do. Now, if we could look a little bit back into the history of Russian relations with Central Asia, there's 3 distinct periods. Firstly, during the 1990s, almost totally neglected. It was regarded as a kind of burden on Russia. They really didn't want to support it any longer, and they neglected it. Secondly, in the early years of Putin, they wanted to try and restore some influence. They recognized that they now had more diplomatic means at their disposal to engage more in the region. And then the third phase, more recently, is Moscow recognizing the importance and bringing a lot more of its tools and instruments into the game to regain influence there. So 3 distinct spheres here. It's interesting too, and I agree with Robert, he mentioned Kyrgyzstan as well, that basically we were bribing 2 presidents. I mean, the Americans were. It was Akayev was putting all this money into private bank accounts in Switzerland, and his successor was basically doing the same. It was a bunch of shell companies that were running that facility or base there. And I can't think of a worse PR way to announce the closure of a base than when you go to Moscow, you sign a deal with Putin and Medvedev, and 2 hours later, in Moscow, you actually publicly announce the closure of the base. So, obviously Russia had a great hand in this, but I wonder whether Russia can actually deliver. Now, what is the EU up to in Central Asia? Well, we agreed during the German presidency a nice new strategy for Central Asia, the usual nice things in it about democracy, human rights, etc. And all these common threats I've listed here about regional security, border management, drugs, crime, and so on. So nobody could dispute any of that. It was all motherhood and apple pie. But of course, the real interest in Central Asia is pipelines. Now, the problem is now there's this race essentially between South Stream and Nabucco. And the EU backs Nabucco, Russia backs South Stream. Key to this is, of course, gas from Turkmenistan and ultimately from Iran. But Iran's not in the game at the present. There's actually how the pipelines are running at the present. Most of them, as you see, are going through Russia and Georgia, and the orange routes are the planned pipelines here. Whether they will ever be built to China is a moot point. I think it's extremely doubtful here. Now, coming on to Russia, China. Well, there's a new book out by Bob Mallow. It's called Axis of Convenience. I think it's a very good description of the Russia-China relationship. They're certainly better than it's ever been before, but it's expediency and pragmatism. And a good example of this was the oil deal signed, I think 2 weeks ago now, when basically Russia needed the money. As Robert said, it was running out of cash for investments internally, and China came up with 25 billion in return for deliveries of oil from East Siberia. So, clear common interest there. But it's rather against, it's a defensive rather than offensive relationship, this. They're against things. They're both against Western values and, I would say, Western influence in Central Asia. But, and here's where, again, I would slightly nuance it differently from Robert. I think fundamentally Russia knows that in the long term its enemy is China. It's not NATO, it's not Europe. The main enemies for Russia are problems, security threats, are Islamic fundamentalism, particularly after the stupid recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which can only fuel independence movements in Northern Caucasus. But ultimately it's China that is going to be the real threat here. Now I think, and most analysts in Europe and US would probably agree, that this new stability between Moscow and Beijing is good. It's good to have that relationship between Beijing and Moscow, but there's lots of problems below the surface. Now, Robert mentioned the illegal immigration, potential border claims. I think that might come up again in the future. I think there's also a certain rivalry for influence in Central Asia. And ultimately, who in the Far East wants Russia as an Asian power? Not China, not India, not Japan. Nobody actually wants Russia as an Asian power. Now, they slipped into APEC, which is practically of no importance, and there's even talk of them now joining ASEAN as part of a new deal to bring in some other new countries. But fundamentally, they're not wanted as an Asian power here. Russia's a status quo power, China's not. Beijing wants a leadership role in Asia. It's quite clear about that and takes a long-term view on this. And this, again, I think would conflict with Russia here. Now, what about EU-China? Well, I think it's interesting to see how the Chinese look at us, because in 2003, they regarded the EU as a very important counter to US hegemony. They produced a policy paper about the EU, praised us as being the pole in the new multipolar world. But then it's gone downhill ever since, in terms of our failure to lift the arms embargo, to grant market economy status, lots of problems on anti-dumping, and of course the perennial problems about Tibet and human rights. And it's no wonder that the current negotiations are running into difficulty. But I think the balance too has tipped slightly, just let me finish that. And just again, literally in the last few weeks, we saw the cancellation of the EU-China summit in December because Sarkozy was meeting the Dalai Lama. I think it was extremely interesting that Wen Jiabao made a specific visit to Brussels to meet Barroso and the Commission, and now they've just announced the date for the new EU-China summit in April after the G20 meeting. China needs the European market under the present circumstances. So it's not a case of one-way street here, it's a case of two-way street, and I think China increasingly recognizes. Japan. Well, it's interesting how perceptions change. You remember all this literature in the early 1990s, particularly from America, about how Japan was going to take over the world. And then within a space of a decade, there was the whole real estate failure, economic collapse, and now, more recently, there's a worrying trade deficit. 46 billion was what I read today in the papers. They're worried about China. They're worried about the relative population balance vis-à-vis China. They still haven't come to terms with their past. I mean, it's been certainly moderated over the last 2 or 3 prime ministers, but there's still, basically, the Chinese know how to play this card when anybody dares to visit the Yasukuni shrine. They've also got a problem, I would say, of their regional image vis-à-vis their international image. But America still obviously places great value in Japan as their top ally in Asia. This is where Clinton went last week. It was interesting that Aza was the first person, Western leader, to get into the White House yesterday. And of course there was a payoff for that because he had to agree to pay the Afghanistan police for the next 6 months. Russia-Japan. Well, the relationship is still very much clouded by 1945 and what happened then. And for the last 2 decades, I reckon, there's been a dispute within the bureaucracy in Japan about how to deal with China. Whether you can actually move at all until that dispute is resolved, or whether you simply say, look, let's put that to one side and let's move forward on a pragmatic basis. And it was interesting last week how it was portrayed in the Japanese media. It was, I think, topped up by the Japanese Foreign Ministry in a partly 2 new leaders getting to know you. But they made this interesting statement, we will solve this in our generation. Now, Medvedev is only in his 40s. I think Mr. Azo is pretty young as well. Their generation could last another 40 years, in fact, so we shall see how long that takes. But there was one step forward, and that was the Sakhalin II agreement to provide Japan with LNG gas, and I think that was quite significant. In terms of EU-Japan, this, I think, has been a rather sorry tale for the EU in terms of neglect of such an important ally. On the surface, we have many shared interests. We used to have a lot of trade disputes. Most of them, I think, have been resolved now. But in terms of our whole multilateral approach to the world, our emphasis on soft power, we and the Japanese, I think, take a similar view. But if you contrast the number of, say, commissioner visits to China with the number of commissioner visits to Japan, India, it's really quite shocking in terms of how little attention has been paid to Japan. It's a relationship that works, I think, and functions well, but without any great publicity to it. Now, India, I just wanted to bring India into the equation because this is another major power coming up, particularly with its new relationship with the US, which both sides are very proud about, based on the nuclear deal. And this, of course, was something that caused all the EU states to pause and think twice about how to develop the relationship with this other strategic partner called India. And I think that more recently, the Indians have put most of their eggs into the American basket. Otherwise, they're focusing on South Asia, their regional background. But they're all also reaching out to China. That relationship's better than it has ever been before, and to Southeast Asia. The elections coming up will be quite important because at the moment, with the communists and the government, it puts a hold on the FTA negotiations between India and the EU. And if that changes, then there is a possibility for that relationship with Europe moving ahead faster. In terms of Russia's relationship with India, well, this has traditionally been one where Moscow has always supported Delhi ever since independence. There's no obvious rivals. Russia doesn't actually interfere very much in South Asia. They both have also, along with China, share this multipolar concept. But the driving force of this relationship is arms sales. There's been a staggering increase in arms sales from Russia to India over recent years. As I said, this is another neglected strategic partner. You would think on the surface we had much in common in terms of the type of constituencies we have, multi-state, multi-ethnic and so on. On the surface we're both committed to human rights, multilateral system, etc., etc. But we've not pushed India's case, nor Japan's case for that matter, in terms of a seat on the European Security Council. And we've been disappointed that India has not stood up and supported us in places like the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. I mentioned the problems over the FTA coming up now. Now, one influential document I wanted to bring your attention to was the East Asia Policy Guidelines that were agreed by the Council just over a year ago now. And this was the EU saying what are our top interests in East Asia, and they put the economy first. They put economic interests right at the top, then stability in terms of North Korea and Taiwan, and then they raised this danger, quite interesting, of competitive nationalism. Didn't go into it in any detail there, but obviously I think then there was a rather bad phase of relations between China and Japan, and they were worried that this could obviously take off in the wrong direction. And they said the EU should get more involved in the region, regional cooperation initiatives, confidence building measures, and increase their dialogue on global issues, as well as promote democracy and human rights. And we should talk more with the United States. Well, we have these conversations allegedly on East Asia. In fact, they focus largely on China and how respectively the US and the EU should approach China. Now, the US role, I just want to make one comment on this, and that is, it's quite clear from Clinton's visit last week that it's going to be a pragmatic approach. Clearly, she was saying in Beijing, we need you need us. We're not going to make a big fuss about human rights. We'll have to mention them from time to time, but given the state of our economy, we want you to go on buying treasury bonds, because if you don't go on buying treasury bonds, we're finished. So that was essentially the message to China. It was interesting to see some of the correspondence in the papers after this, but I think by and large there's a consensus, and there was a feeling of relief, I think, in Asia that Clinton went there first, and also that the news she took. With Russia, the quote from Munich was, time to press the reset button, and now everyone in Russia is running around trying to find a computer analogy to reply to this. It's quite clear that the emphasis will be on an arms control agenda, and this is good. It's been neglected over recent years, and we benefit from this. We will have nothing to say about this agenda, by the way. This will be done over the heads of Europe. But the fact that Washington and Moscow are talking to each other again on strategic issues is very important for that relationship and also for the EU-Russia relationship. It will give Moscow, I think, rather more confidence that they're being taken seriously again. With the China, I just mentioned that both sides now recognize their independence. I mentioned Japan, I mentioned India before. Central Asia, I think it's partly important for supply routes to Afghanistan. They have alternatives apart from Kyrgyzstan. And I think the US still wants to try and play about something of a balancing act between Russia and China. And they're not giving up, I would say, on energy because they have a commercial interest in some of the pipeline routes here. Now, just to sort of conclude about what are the prospects for EU-Russia cooperation and what are the implications of what Russia is doing for the EU. Afghanistan, they're blowing hot and cold. You know, on the one hand, they basically tell Kyrgyzstan to close down the base, and on the other hand, they say, well, we'll allow you overflying rights for civilian goods and possibly even military goods if you play ball with us, which is code for saying stop expanding NATO. On Iran and the Middle East, I think their potential is overrated here. And I think it's wrong to give the impression that the US or Europe is dependent on Russia or for either solving Iran or for the Middle East. Of course, it would be good to have Russia on board, but we don't ultimately know whether they want to help make a deal or whether they prefer to go along as a kind of spoiler in terms of not wanting negotiations with Iran or the Middle East to succeed. There's a strong case to be made there, and that might be their preferred policy. Drugs is a huge problem internally in Russia. Again, most of it's coming from Afghanistan. They have a lackluster form of cooperation with the EU in this, but there are people in Justice and Home Affairs, Justice and Freedom Security, whatever it's called now, who say this is an agenda where seriously they want to actually improve cooperation with us. But the big issue of all, I think, in terms of how EU and Russia can cooperate in the classic, obvious win-win situation is energy efficiency. Russia loses a vast amount of energy because of outdated infrastructure, poor insulation of housing, factories, etc. This is an area where we have the know-how, the technology, finance to help them. It would also help them meet the Kyoto targets. So we should be working, in my view, side by side in the run-up to Copenhagen. Russia is the third biggest CO2 emitter in the world. And this is an area where, if we can change their perceptions, they think that we're out to steal their natural resources. If we can somehow get it into their heads, no, this is a real win-win situation, I think we can move forward. Now, where could we cooperate on Central Asia? Because we are, I think, partly rivals, or more rivals than potential partners here. But the one area that springs to mind is water management, which is potential for serious conflict in Central Asia. The EU has got a record in terms of organizing difficult resource areas for the common good. And here, I think that experience could be put to use in Central Asia here. There's also this still vague Medvedev proposal on European security on the table, how to take that forward. Again, looking a little bit forward, we're having a Central Asian chair of the OSCE the year after next, and how to actually involve them more to preserve the basket 3 would be, I think, quite an interesting case. So, what are my conclusions on this? Well, Russia's looking east is a challenge for the EU, but it's also an opportunity here. I think I'll have to go into this in a bit more detail. The problems facing Russia are underestimated so far in terms, and this will limit the resources that they can devote to foreign policy and to promoting foreign policy. And it's getting worse day by day. So that's a limitation on what Russia can do. Good Russia relations are good for us, good for the world, but there's a lot of problems just below the surface. Above all, they don't like each other. There's a huge amount of basically ethnic hatred towards them. Russia doesn't like Chinese. The Chinese look down on Russia. So the idea that there could be some popular rapprochement is, I think, just not on. I argue too that a solid US-Russia relationship is good for the EU. I think it's been very bad that the Bush administration has neglected relations with Russia over the last few years, so it's important that this relationship is back on track again. And I think that Russia is basically quite an unstable society now, and this means that you cannot predict Russian foreign policy. They're all over the place. They have no consistency in what they're doing on almost any of the major issues just now, and hence you get so many contradictory messages coming from different spokesmen, sometimes even from the same department. You know, you get the chief of the general staff saying we must build up our Arctic fleet, and then this is the next day sort of denied by the foreign ministry, and so on. There's dozens of examples of this. I mean, the instant recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia was a huge mistake, complete diplomatic failure. And when one talks about, you know, their so-called allies, not one of them, except Nicaragua, has actually, you know, gone ahead and recognized these two states. And then I think we and Russia are going to be more competitors in Central Asia than we are in the Far East, because I regret that I think we're going to rather neglect, because we in Europe will also be dealing more with our internal problems. We're not going to, I think, devote the resources to either Central Asia or East Asia that we should do. And then we have this additional burden seen by some people anyway, that we constantly promote normative powers, human rights, democracy. You know, if China goes in to Central Asia, or Russia goes into Central Asia, they don't start talking about, you know, how bad their prison systems are, how much trafficking is going on, etc., etc. They just make deals. The EU still goes in and has to go back and explain to the member states why they're going to make a deal with Uzbekistan or lift sanctions on Uzbekistan after the president's been, unfortunately, killing 200 citizens in a little demonstration. So that is an extra element that the EU has to take into account. But fundamentally, the EU has to pay more attention to both that region, Central Asia, and to its strategic partners in the Far East, because perhaps this is not the best way to conclude a remark in Vic's Institute. We pay far too much attention to China and not enough attention to India and Japan. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that provocative remark. I think that both speakers have brought to the table enough points for discussion, so I even wonder whether we will be able to deal with all of them in the hour that remains before before us, so I would give the floor to you now for questions. Who will come first?
Two questions to Dr. Cameron. You mentioned that in the eyes of Russia, China is a threat. I don't know what kind of threat to the Far Eastern threat, is a threat to Russians' traditional power, or what kind of psychological threat or something to do. And you also mentioned that the Chinese and the Russian mutual looks down upon each other. I don't know why you have such conclusions. At the same time, also you mentioned that Russia is a statistical power and China is a revisionist power. This is definitely different with your colleague, Jan Johnston, that China is statistical power, even in Asia. For example, in the Asian integration, I think that China encouraged the ASEAN to take the leading role, not China to take the leading role. And I think, why should China take the leading role to dominate Asia? It's not just repeated history. I think China learned huge lessons from history. And also we learn lessons from European Union to repeat the strategy of the great power politics. So I think we want to have more your experience, please. Thank you.
Why is China a threat to Russia? Because if you accept that Russia wants to be a global power, and if you accept the Russian thesis that this is a zero-sum game, as they rise, somebody must fall, they look at China and they see the unbelievable economic growth of China over the last decade, and they see how China is steadily increasing its influence on the world stage as a more prominent actor, and they think, rightly or wrongly, that that will have implications for their own position in the world. So that is fundamentally, the problem as seen from Moscow. China's rise means that other powers will be falling, and they will be among them.
But India also is rising, but I would never consider India also.
Yeah, but China, if they don't consider, because they don't directly border India with the same eyes as they do China. China, because of the length of that border, 150 million people on the other side compared to 5 million there, that's what they see as the ultimate nightmare. That is, they don't talk about it, but you actually go and talk to people in think tanks or in some of the ministries in Moscow, that is what you hear. This idea that NATO is a threat is nonsense. I mean, they believe that just for propaganda purposes, for the military to buy a few more toys and so on. They don't want NATO expansion, but they know that NATO is not going to attack them or, Western Europe's not a threat to them. The threat